It begins not with a crash of thunder, not with a proclamation from any throne. It begins with a farmer in Burgundy reaching into the soil one morning in the summer of 1315 and pulling out a fistful of black rot. He stares at it for a long time. He has farmed this land for 30 years. His father farmed it before him. His grandfather broke this same earth with an iron-tipped plough when the memory of the First Crusade was still warm. He has seen wet summers. He has seen lean winters. He has seen the odd failed crop, the late frost, the September flood. He has never seen this. The grain should be standing tall by now. The rye should be swelling. The oats should be rippling gold in the summer light. But the summer light has not come. It has been raining since April. Not the soft, nurturing rains of a good planting season. These are cold rains. Biblical rains. Rains that soak into the earth and refuse to leave. That pool in furrows that turn lanes into rivers and rivers into spreading grey lakes. The sky is a ceiling of wet wool, and it has not lifted in 3 months. The farmer looks up. He squints at a sky that should be burning blue and finds instead that same low, featureless cloud. The same cloud it seems he has been living beneath since the world was made, heavy with a cold it should not carry in July. He opens his hand and lets the black grain fall. Somewhere behind him, his children are waiting to eat. What this farmer does not yet know, what no single person alive in Europe in 1315 can possibly know, is that he is not alone in this. He is one of 40 million people standing in the same rain. He is one of 40 million people staring at the same ruined harvest. He is living at the beginning of the end of a world. Not the end of the medieval world in the grand historical sense. Not yet. That particular reckoning still waits 30 years down the road, crouched in the belly of a ship somewhere in Central Asia, patient and invisible. No. What is ending now in the summer of 1315 is something subtler and more intimate. What is ending is a way of eating, a way of surviving, a rhythm of life that entire civilizations had organized themselves around for 3 centuries. The Great Famine. It will last 7 years. It will kill between 10 and 15% of the population of Northern Europe, in some regions closer to half, and it begins here, in a field, in the rain, with a farmer holding black grain and not yet knowing what the blackness means. This is the story of the Great Frost. The year summer disappeared from Europe, and what happened when a civilization that had forgotten how to be hungry suddenly remembered. To understand the catastrophe, you first have to understand what was lost. For roughly 300 years before the rains came, from approximately the year 950 until the early 1300s, Europe had been living in something close to paradise. Not paradise in any comfortable sense that we would recognize. The lives of ordinary people were still hard, brief, and frequently brutal. Plague, violence, and feudal servitude were constants. But by the standards of earlier medieval centuries, by the grueling baseline of the Carolingian Dark, this era, which historians now call the medieval warm period, or the medieval climate optimum, was a time of remarkable expansion, abundance, and possibility. The temperatures had climbed, not dramatically, not by any standard that would register against modern climate change, perhaps 1 degree Celsius warmer than the cold centuries that preceded. But 1 degree, in an agricultural civilization living at the margins of subsistence, changes everything. Growing seasons had lengthened. Marginal land, hillsides too cold or too wet in earlier centuries, had become viable farmland. Vineyards climbed to latitudes they had never before reached. The English grew grapes in Northamptonshire. The Norse grew barley in Greenland. The great wetlands and forests of northern Europe were being cleared and drained and ploughed at a rate that had not been seen since the Roman occupation, and would not be seen again until the industrial era. Population followed food. The population of Europe in the year 1000 was perhaps 35 million people. By 1300 it had more than doubled. Some estimates put it as high as 75 million. New towns appeared. Old towns swelled into cities. Paris became a genuine metropolis. London broke 100,000 inhabitants. Cologne, Venice, Florence, Ghent. These were not sleepy provincial centres but humming commercial capitals, sophisticated and crowded, glutted with merchants and scholars and craftsmen and pilgrims. The great cathedrals went up, not just Chartres and Notre Dame and Salisbury. Every town, every moderately prosperous village began extending its church upward, adding a nave, buttressing a tower, commissioning a rose window. It was an architecture of confidence. These were buildings designed to last forever, raised by people who believed that the world they lived in was fundamentally stable, fundamentally expanding, fundamentally safe. But this prosperity came with a hidden fragility, one that nobody was in a position to fully see while living inside it. Europe's population had grown right up to, and arguably slightly beyond, the productive ceiling of its agricultural system. The expansion of farmland had been enormous, but it was not unlimited. By 1300, the best farmland was already under cultivation. What remained was marginal, thin soils on hillsides, boggy lowlands that needed constant drainage, northern fields where the growing season was already short. Worse, the farms that were already in production were beginning to show signs of exhaustion. Centuries of intensive cultivation without adequate crop rotation or soil restoration were degrading yields on the oldest and best established fields. The three-field rotation system, a genuinely brilliant medieval agricultural innovation, could only do so much against the compounding depletion of overworked soil. And feeding this vast population left almost no buffer. Ordinary people in 1300 were consuming nearly everything that the land produced. The granaries were not empty, but neither were they deep. A bad year could be absorbed. 2 bad years in succession would stretch the system to breaking. 3 bad years would shatter it entirely. The climate for 3 centuries had been holding the game together. It had kept the growing seasons long enough, the winters mild enough, the summers dry enough to allow this extraordinary expansion. The civilization of medieval Europe had grown large in the warmth, the way a plant grows quickly when given good soil and reliable sun. Nobody asked what would happen if the warmth stopped. In 1315, they found out. The medieval warm period ended, not gradually, not with polite warning. It ended the way all the worst things end, abruptly, in the middle of ordinary life, during a season when everyone was busy doing something else. The Atlantic storm systems shifted. Cold Arctic air began pushing further south and staying longer. The patterns that had delivered reliable, warm, relatively dry summers to northern Europe for 300 years simply stopped, and the rains began. The farmer in Burgundy kneeling in the mud was not living through a temporary setback. He was living through the pivot point of an age. The long prosperity, the 3-century gift of warmth and possibility, was over. The world that replaced it would be colder, darker, and smaller in every sense that mattered to a human being trying to feed a family. But first, before any of what comes next, you need to understand the rain. The spring of 1315 was already wrong. In a normal year, northern Europe would have seen the winter rains diminish through March and April, the soil dry and warm through May, and the critical window for planting, the window upon which the entire year's food supply depended, open reliably by late April or early May. By June, crops would be in the ground. By late August, with reasonable luck and reasonable weather, the harvest would begin. In 1315, none of this happened. The rains that had begun in autumn of 1314 simply continued, through December, through January, through the brief freezing weeks of February, which at least stopped the rain and replaced it with snow, giving the saturated earth a brief respite before the thaw turned the snowmelt into yet more standing water, through March, April, and then into May, June, July. By midsummer of 1315, chroniclers across northern Europe were noting the same extraordinary thing. It had not stopped raining for the better part of 9 months. The monk John of Trocolo, writing at St Albans Abbey in England, described the summer of 1315 with a spare, horrified clarity that still reads as almost modern in its emotional precision. The rains were so incessant, he wrote, that the fields could not be ploughed. The seed that was sown floated out of the waterlogged soil and rotted on the surface. The hay could not be cut, and when it was cut it could not dry, and what could not dry could not be stored, and without stored hay the cattle and the horses that powered the entire agricultural economy would go into winter without fodder. In Flanders, the great commercial heart of northern European cloth production, civic records from the town of Ypres tell a similar story. The city had been one of the most prosperous in all of Europe, a thundering engine of textile manufacture, of merchant wealth, of urban sophistication. In 1315, the city began recording the names of the dead. Not the violent dead, not the plague dead, but simply the dead, people found in the streets, collapsed in alleyways, expired in doorways. The city's death registers from 1315 show a doubling of the normal mortality rate, and the famine had barely started. Across the English Channel, the English harvest of 1315 was the worst in living memory. Contemporary estimates put the shortfall at somewhere between 50 and 60% of a normal year's grain production. In practical terms, this meant that the crop that came out of English fields in the autumn of 1315 was enough to feed England for perhaps 6 or 7 months. The other 5 or 6 months would need to be bridged somehow, by buying grain from elsewhere, by drawing down whatever reserves existed, by finding alternatives. The problem was that there was nowhere else to buy grain from. The disaster was continental. The same rains that had ruined the English harvest had ruined the French harvest, the Flemish harvest, the German harvest, the Scandinavian harvest. There was no functioning grain market to appeal to because every grain-producing region in Northern Europe was facing the same catastrophic shortfall simultaneously. This was the crucial difference between a regional bad year, which medieval economies had survived before, and a systemic climate-driven disaster. When the climate itself changed, there was no outside. There was no unaffected region to draw on. The entire network failed at once. What made 1315 particularly vicious was not just the rain, but the cold that accompanied it. The temperature drop that had triggered the shift in Atlantic weather patterns meant that even on the days the rain briefly stopped, the sunlight was thin and low, and unable to warm the soil or dry the crops. The critical ripening period, the weeks in late summer when grain converts starch to sugar and firms up for harvest, simply did not occur. Grain that should have been golden and dry was still green and wet in August. What finally came out of the fields in September was not grain in any useful sense. It was waterlogged, beginning to sprout prematurely in the ear, shot through with the dark threads of ergot and mould. Ergot, a fungal infection of rye and other grains, caused by wet conditions, producing alkaloids that in sufficient quantities cause a terrifying constellation of symptoms: convulsions, hallucinations, intense burning sensations in the extremities, followed eventually by dry gangrene, as blood vessels contracted and extremities were starved of circulation until they blackened and fell away. In a wet year, ergot could contaminate a significant fraction of the rye crop. In a very wet year, with persistent dampness at exactly the wrong moments in the grain's development, ergot could devastate it. The rains of 1315 were a very wet year. The year 1315 ended in cold and rain, and the first stirrings of real hunger. The granaries were lower than they had been in anyone's living memory. The fodder stocks were critically short. The livestock that the farming economy depended upon, the oxen that pulled the ploughs, the horses that carried the grain, the pigs and cattle that converted agricultural waste into winter protein, had come into winter thin and poorly provisioned. And somewhere over the grey Atlantic the next season's storm systems were already forming. The rains were not done. They had barely started. In the year 1316, the rains came back. Before you can understand what happened to the people of Northern Europe between 1315 and 1322, you need to understand how starvation actually works. Not as an abstraction, not as a moral shock, but as a mechanical process, as a system running down. Modern nutritional science gives us the numbers. The average adult engaged in moderate physical labour, and nearly every adult in medieval Europe was engaged in moderate to heavy physical labour every day, requires roughly 2,000 to 2,500 kilocalories per day to maintain weight and function. Medieval peasants, who were doing hard outdoor physical work from sunrise to sunset for most of the year, likely needed closer to 3,000 to 3,500. What the typical medieval peasant diet actually delivered in a good year was approximately 2,000 to 2,500 kilocalories, enough to sustain life and work, but without much margin. The diet was heavy in grain. Bread and pottage made from rye, wheat, oats, or barley accounted for perhaps 70 to 80% of total caloric intake in ordinary households. Legumes, root vegetables, and what limited dairy and meat the season allowed made up most of the rest. In a year when the grain harvest fell by 50%, the math became merciless. A 50% shortfall in grain production did not mean 50% of people got 50% less food. Distribution was far more complicated than that, and far more brutal. What a 50% shortfall actually produced was a price crisis, a catastrophic, almost instantaneous spike in the cost of grain that functioned like a tax that fell most heavily on those with the least margin. In England, the price of wheat rose by approximately 800% between 1315 and 1316. Rye, barley, oats all followed similar trajectories. The cost of a loaf of bread that had been affordable for an ordinary labourer in 1314 was, by 1316, the equivalent of nearly a week's wages. Meat prices spiked even more steeply, as livestock, the animals that could be converted from consuming grain to producing food, were slaughtered in desperation, and the resulting market surge in available protein was followed within months by a collapse of animal populations that would haunt the next decade. The hierarchy of starvation emerged quickly. At the top, the wealthy, great lords, bishops, prosperous merchants, had deep enough reserves and wide enough resources to maintain something approaching adequate nutrition throughout the famine years. They suffered, they tightened, they made substitutions and economies, but they did not starve. Below them, the middling, urban craftsmen, free peasants with enough land to have maintained some reserves, minor clergy with institutional backing. These people experienced genuine hunger. Their diet narrowed dramatically. Their health deteriorated in ways that would not be immediately fatal, but would compromise their resistance to the diseases that would follow. Their children grew more slowly. Their productivity fell. At the bottom, the landless labourers, the urban poor, the rural smallholders with no reserves and no safety net, the widows and the orphans and the elderly living on the margins of household charity. These were the people who died first, and in the greatest numbers. The institutional response of medieval society to famine was not, it must be said, absent, but it was pitifully inadequate to the scale of what was happening. The Church, which operated the most extensive network of charitable institutions in medieval Europe, hospitals, hospices, monastic guest houses, episcopal poor relief programs, expanded its relief operations significantly in the famine years. English monasteries opened their gates and distributed bread and pottage to the desperate. French bishops organised almsgiving. Flemish city governments, already among the most sophisticated administrative bodies in Northern Europe, tried to regulate grain prices and organise municipal grain purchases. None of it was remotely enough. The Church's reserves were not designed to feed an entire continent. The price regulations could not create grain that did not exist. The municipal grain purchases required functional grain markets in other regions, and those markets were not functioning. One of the most painful features of the Great Famine, one that distinguishes it clearly from earlier, more localised famines that medieval society had absorbed, was the way it overwhelmed the ordinary mechanisms of charity and mutual aid that communities had relied upon for generations. The normal flow of help from neighbour to neighbour, from lord to peasant, from monastery to village, from town to hinterland, all of it still happened. People were not suddenly indifferent to each other's suffering. But the quantities involved were so vast, the duration so extended, the affected population so enormous, that the normal channels of relief could only absorb a tiny fraction of the need. The body, faced with chronic caloric deficit, adapts in predictable and pitiless ways. First, the fat reserves go. For people who had little fat to begin with, and medieval peasants by and large did not, this phase was brief, weeks, not months. Then the body begins to consume muscle. The great visible sign of famine, the paradoxical swelling of the extremities and abdomen that accompanies severe protein deficiency, the condition now clinically known as kwashiorkor, begins to appear. People who appear bloated are not being well fed. They are experiencing the advanced stage of starvation, the body's desperate attempt to manage fluid imbalances as its protein supply collapses. The immune system, starved of the micronutrients and proteins it needs to function, begins to fail. And when the immune system fails, every disease that normally circulates at manageable levels in a population becomes lethal. The colds that healthy people shrug off, the intestinal infections that well-fed bodies clear in days, the respiratory infections that the robust survive, starvation turns every one of these into a potential death sentence, and in 1316 and 1317, as the second and third consecutive harvest failures accumulated and the immune systems of millions of people progressively failed, the diseases came. The famine did not only kill through direct starvation, it killed through the cascade of vulnerabilities that starvation created. And in 1316, the rains came again, and the cascade was just beginning. One of the least discussed dimensions of the Great Famine is what it did to the animals. When historians write about famine, the focus naturally falls on human suffering and human death. But the animals, the livestock that represented both a critical food reserve and the essential engine of agricultural production, were dying too, and their deaths would compound human suffering in ways that extended far beyond the immediate food supply crisis. In the winter of 1315-1316, faced with catastrophically short fodder stocks, European farmers confronted a brutal choice that had no good answer. They could slaughter their animals now while the animals still had some meat on them, and take whatever food value was available, or they could try to keep the animals alive through the winter on reduced rations, hoping that the spring would bring better weather and a chance for recovery. Either path was a gamble with devastating downside risk. Those who slaughtered their animals got some food: meat, fat, leather, bone. Families who were already hungry in the autumn of 1315 got through that winter on the carcasses of their own livestock. But they entered the spring of 1316 with no breeding stock, no draft animals, and no future. Those who tried to keep their animals alive through the terrible winter mostly failed. Contemporary chronicles describe cattle and horses so weakened by malnutrition that they could barely stand. Animals that survived the winter were too weak to plough. Fields that needed ploughing in early spring could not be worked. Crops that needed to go in the ground in April could not be planted on time. The 1316 growing season was compromised before it even started, not just by the continued rain, but by the collapse of the animal labour that the agricultural system depended upon. There is a specific category of livestock that deserves particular attention here, because its loss had consequences that reverberated for decades: the breeding population. In a normal economy, farmers maintained breeding pairs, the animals from which next year's livestock would come. During the Great Famine, the breeding animals went into the pot alongside everyone else. The English cattle herd, which had taken generations to build through careful selective breeding and management, was decimated. The same was true across the Channel, in France, Flanders, and the German principalities. Livestock populations crashed at rates that contemporary records suggest were catastrophic. The significance of this is not merely the immediate food loss. Animals reproduce slowly. A cow takes 9 months to gestate a single calf. A pig can produce larger litters more frequently, but pigs too require feed and management. Rebuilding a devastated livestock population takes years, during which the agricultural system is operating without the animal labour and animal fertility, the manure that fertilised fields, that it needs to function properly. The Great Famine did not just take a few years of harvests. It took the breeding stock, it took the agricultural capital, it took the productive machinery of European farming and smashed it at a moment when the remaining human population desperately needed that machinery to function at maximum capacity. There was another animal whose loss had a dimension beyond simple economics: the horse. Medieval warfare was conducted on horseback. The military power of the feudal system, the knights and their retinues, the cavalry that made armies mobile and decisive, was built entirely on a functioning supply of trained warhorses. Warhorses were extraordinarily expensive, requiring years of training and feeding on high-quality grain and forage. They were not food animals in any normal sense. Nobody ate a warhorse if they could possibly avoid it. In 1316 and 1317, they could not possibly avoid it. Chronicles from England, France, and the Low Countries record the slaughter of warhorses for food with a horror that is almost visceral in the sources. These were animals worth 40 or 50 times the annual income of a peasant, and they were being butchered and eaten not by starving peasants, but by lords and knights who had run out of alternatives. The feudal military class was consuming its own military capability to stay alive. The cattle murrain of 1319 to 1322 delivered the killing blow to European livestock. Just as populations of animals weakened by famine and poor management were beginning to recover, a new cattle disease, the nature of which remains debated by historians and veterinary scientists, though rinderpest is the most probable candidate, swept through the cattle populations of northern Europe with terrifying speed and lethality. Mortality rates among affected cattle herds ran to 60% in some regions, 70%. In the hardest-hit areas of England, virtually the entire cattle population died. An animal that takes years to breed back after normal population loss was now being hit with an epidemic that killed the survivors of the famine years in their remaining numbers. It is not an exaggeration to say that the cattle murrain, arriving on top of 7 years of famine, effectively destroyed the working animal base of English and Northern European agriculture. The recovery from this double blow, famine and murrain together, would take not years but decades. By the time the famines finally ended in the early 1320s, Europe's agricultural system had not merely suffered a series of bad harvests. It had been structurally dismantled. The land was there, the knowledge was there, but the animals that powered the system, the oxen that broke the soil, the horses that moved the grain, the cattle that provided dairy and traction, and the manure that restored depleted fields, were in vast regions of northern Europe simply gone. The fields were there, the tools were there, the people, those who had survived, were there. But the animals that made it all work were gone, and their absence would shadow European agriculture for a generation. When the bread runs out, people eat other things. This sounds almost simple when stated baldly, but the history of what people actually ate during the Great Famine, the specific substances, the creative and desperate adaptations, the lines that eventually got crossed, is one of the more intimate and disturbing windows into what extreme hunger actually does to human beings and human societies. The first substitutions were reasonable and traditional. Medieval communities had always supplemented grain-heavy diets with forage. Wild greens, nettles, dandelion leaves, sorrel, watercress, wild garlic were familiar additions to the diet, particularly in spring before the first garden vegetables were ready. Mushrooms and woodland fungi, berries in season, hazelnuts and acorns, freshwater fish from streams and rivers, small birds and rabbits taken by anyone with a snare. In the early months of the famine, these alternatives were heavily exploited. The forests and woodlands of northern Europe were stripped of every edible thing they contained by populations that needed them as never before. But the forest could not feed 40 million people. The wild food resources of medieval Europe, substantial by the standards of any single community drawing on them in normal times, were utterly overwhelmed by the concentrated desperation of a continental famine. Within months, the forage supplements were exhausted. The easy things were gone first, then the harder things, then things that were only marginally edible. Tree bark became a famine food of extraordinary importance, not the outer woody bark, but the inner cambium layer, the pale, slightly sweet, starchy tissue that lies just beneath the surface. This had been an emergency food in northern Europe since at least the Viking Age, known in Scandinavia as bark bread in Swedish, where it was mixed with whatever grain flour was available to stretch limited supplies. During the Great Famine, bark processing became widespread across northern Europe, practiced by populations who had never done it before, and who were learning as they went. The problem with bark as food is that its nutritional value is low and its palatability is poor. It can prevent immediate starvation. It cannot sustain health, particularly not the health of children and the elderly, whose digestive systems tolerate these fibrous, anti-nutrient-rich substitutes worst. Leather was boiled. Horse hides that would normally have gone to the tanner were cut up and cooked into a gelatinous, nutritionally marginal soup. Manuscripts from England describe people cooking shoes, belts, and whatever other leather goods they possessed. The collagen in boiled leather provides some calories. Not many, enough perhaps to defer death by a few days. Cats and dogs were eaten. This is documented across multiple independent sources from England, France, Flanders, and the German states. Not just the pets of the comfortable, though those too, but the working animals, the farm dogs, the cats that controlled grain stores. Animals that had served the agricultural household in roles beyond nutrition now became nutrition themselves. Populations that had strict cultural taboos against eating these animals abandoned those taboos quickly once starvation became acute. Horses, as we have noted, were eaten. Donkeys, mules. Whatever moved and could be caught was assessed as potential food, with a practicality that hunger makes ruthless. And then there were the stories. The chronicles of the Great Famine contain references to cannibalism. This is said plainly because the sources say it plainly, and a history of this period that sidesteps it is incomplete. Contemporary accounts, several of them, from different regions, written by different chroniclers who had no reason to coordinate their stories, describe people consuming the dead. In some accounts, graves were robbed. In others, the most desperate references involved the living and the most vulnerable. Historians debate the extent and prevalence of these accounts. Some appear to be rumour and moral horror rather than documented fact. The attribution of extreme behaviour to the desperately poor was a rhetorical move in medieval culture as well as a response to genuine events. But the sheer number of independent sources from England to Poland, describing similar things during the same years, makes it impossible to dismiss all such accounts as mere legend. What can be said with confidence? The Great Famine pushed significant numbers of people in Northern Europe past every social constraint and cultural taboo that normally governs human behaviour. The social order did not collapse, not entirely, not everywhere, but it bent. In the places where it bent furthest, the worst human behaviours were documented alongside the best. The desperate ingenuity of the starving is also, it must be said, a story of genuine human creativity and endurance. Across Northern Europe, people developed and shared techniques for extracting nutrition from materials they would normally discard. They organised, as best they could, systems of collective survival. Monasteries fed thousands. Towns organised soup kitchens centuries before that phrase existed. Families made decisions. Terrible decisions, but decisions aimed at ensuring that at least some members survived when not all could be kept alive. The mathematics of survival during the Great Famine was often the mathematics of triage: who can be sustained and who cannot. These decisions were made in cottages and great halls across a continent, usually without being written down, usually without our knowledge, by ordinary people confronting circumstances that no amount of human preparation or human virtue could have made easy. They made do. Many of them did not survive making do, but many of them did. And the next generation, the children who lived through these years as small children, who were shaped by hunger and loss in ways that would last their entire lives, would be the generation that faced the Black Death. The cities suffered differently than the countryside. They suffered, in many ways, worse. Medieval cities were not self-sufficient. They were, by definition, dependent on the agricultural hinterland for their food supply. A city like Ypres, one of the great commercial centres of 14th century Europe, a city that in its prime hosted an international cloth fair drawing merchants from across the known world, was importing virtually every calorie that fed its population. The city produced cloth. The countryside produced food. The exchange kept both alive. When the harvest failed, this elegant system inverted instantly. The countryside had bad food in small quantities, which it needed for its own survival. The cities had no food at all and no way to produce it, and populations that could not simply disperse into the fields and forage for survival the way rural communities, however marginally one could. What made the urban situation particularly critical was the presence of the urban poor, a population category that barely existed in earlier centuries but had grown enormously during the long prosperity, drawn to the cities by the economic opportunity of the textile boom. These were workers in the cloth trade, carders, weavers, fullers, dyers, and the vast supporting service economy that surrounded them. They lived in rented rooms in dense urban neighbourhoods. They owned no land. They had no access to agricultural production. They depended entirely on their wages to buy food, and their wages to buy food, and their wages depended on the continued functioning of the textile trade. When the famine hit and grain prices spiked by 800%, these workers were confronted simultaneously with wages that were either falling or disappearing entirely, because the luxury textile trade collapsed in a famine, and food prices that had multiplied beyond any possibility of meeting them. The city of Ypres has left us the most detailed urban mortality records from the Great Famine, and they are extraordinary documents in their spare horror. The city's poor relief rolls, the lists of people receiving charity assistance from the city government, expanded dramatically from 1315 onward. By 1316, the records show approximately 2,800 people dying in Ypres over a 6-month period. In a city whose total population was perhaps 25,000 to 30,000, this represents roughly 10% of the population dead in a single half year. The bodies were collected daily from the streets. The city records show payments to men employed specifically to remove the dead from public spaces, an urban sanitation function that had presumably never been needed at this scale before. The death register does not record causes, but the pattern of ages represented in it tells the story. Disproportionately young children, disproportionately the elderly. The famine killed the vulnerable first. London, on the other side of the Channel, experienced a similar urban crisis, though with different political and institutional contours. The city had grown enormously during the long prosperity, and its population, estimated at 80,000 to 100,000 in the early 14th century, was densely packed into the area within and immediately around the old Roman walls. London's response to the famine was shaped by its peculiar constitutional position As a city with significant self-governing capacity, the city council intervened to try to regulate grain prices, to prevent hoarding, and to ensure that available supplies reached the poor rather than being monopolized by wealthy merchants. The records show repeated, increasingly frustrated attempts to stop the kind of speculative hoarding that price crises always generate, wealthy individuals buying up grain supplies to sell later at higher prices. These efforts were only partially successful, and this partial success had a specific texture in London's case. The city's hospitals, St Bartholomew's, St Thomas's, found themselves overwhelmed not merely by the malnourished, but by the wave of secondary infections that malnutrition made lethal. The sick and the dying were arriving faster than they could be accommodated. The institutional capacity of medieval London's medical and charitable infrastructure, impressive by the standards of its time, was simply not designed for a sustained multi-year humanitarian crisis of this magnitude. In Bruges, the other great Flemish commercial city, the response was perhaps the most sophisticated of any medieval European city, reflecting Bruges' particularly advanced urban governance. The city established what amount to early public granaries, buying grain when available, and distributing it at controlled prices. It expanded its hospice capacity. It organised labour for city-funded public works projects, road repair, ditch clearing, to provide employment and wages to workers displaced from the textile trade. And still, people died in the streets. The urban famine experience was concentrated and visible in a way that rural suffering was not. In the countryside, people died in isolated farmsteads, in scattered villages, in places where the only witnesses were neighbours who were themselves struggling. But in the cities, death was public. It happened on the main streets, in front of the great civic buildings, in view of the Cloth Hall and the Cathedral and the Guildhall. This visibility had political consequences. Medieval city governments that had spent the long prosperity becoming increasingly sophisticated in their administrative capacity were now being tested in the most direct possible way. The people in the streets were not abstractions. They were constituents, in the loose medieval sense of the urban body politic. Their deaths were not invisible. Some cities rose to the challenge. Bruges' interventions, however inadequate to fully stop the dying, were genuine attempts at systematic relief and set precedents that would inform later European poor relief for generations. Others did not. In some cities, the wealthy simply retreated behind their walls and waited for the worst to pass. Beyond the great commercial cities, the smaller market towns, the intermediate layer of the medieval urban hierarchy, suffered a particular kind of quiet destruction during the famine years that has received less historical attention but was perhaps equally significant in its long-term consequences. Market towns were the nodes of the rural economy, the places where peasants sold surplus production, bought tools and cloth and salt, paid rents and legal fees, conducted the small commerce that connected the agricultural hinterland to the great trading cities. They were small by modern standards, a few thousand inhabitants typically, but they were essential to the functioning of the local economy. The market town's relationship with the famine was different from both the great cities and the villages. The market town was not self-sufficient enough to absorb the famine the way a well-managed manor might, but it was also not large enough to have the institutional resources, the great hospitals, the monastic establishments, the civic granaries, that the larger cities could deploy. What the market town had instead was its market, and the market during the famine became a battleground. The grain market during the famine years was a study in the pathologies that extreme scarcity creates in commercial systems. Hoarding, the rational behaviour of any individual holder of grain who understood that prices were still rising and who could survive long enough to wait, removed supplies from the market at precisely the moment when the market most needed supply. Speculation, the purchase of grain not for consumption but for resale at higher prices, was simultaneously rational at the individual level and catastrophically destructive at the systemic level. The market town's constables, aldermen and magistrates, many of them themselves holders of grain and therefore not entirely disinterested parties, tried to regulate these behaviours with mixed effectiveness and motivations. The records of English market towns from 1315 to 1319 are full of prosecutions for forestalling, buying before the market to sell at higher prices, regrating, buying at market to sell at higher prices in the same market, and engrossing, buying large quantities to create artificial scarcity. These prosecutions were real attempts to maintain market function. They were also, regularly, exercises in political power. wealthy market participants using the legal system against each other in the competition for scarce resources, with the poor watching from outside the process entirely. What the market town records reveal, in their aggregate, is the unmaking of the commercial trust that the long prosperity had built. The market worked when there was enough for everyone. When there was not enough, the market revealed all the tensions and conflicts that the abundance had papered over. And the revelation stuck. Communities that had watched their neighbours hoard, speculate, and use legal process to advantage themselves during the famine did not forget these behaviours when better years returned. The memory of the famine market poisoned the social well of many small communities for a generation. Either way, the urban experience of the Great Famine left marks on European cities that went beyond the immediate dead. It shaped how city governments thought about their responsibilities. It demonstrated, with terrible clarity, the vulnerability of urban populations that depended on food networks they did not control, and it began changing who lived in the cities. The people who could leave, left. They went back to the countryside, to family land, to the marginal subsistence of rural survival that at least gave them access to something they could grow. The urban poor who could not leave remained in cities that were becoming year by year more dangerous and less populated. The great commercial boom of the medieval warm period had built these cities up to their extraordinary size in a generation. The Great Famine would spend a decade quietly hollowing them out. Famine does not only kill, it also corrupts. Not in any simple moral sense, not as a judgment on the people who made desperate choices under impossible conditions, but in the sense that the social structures and norms that hold communities together are not independent of the material conditions that make those communities functional. When those conditions collapse, the structures begin to deform. The Great Famine produced a documented surge in crime across Northern Europe. The English court records of the famine years tell a specific story. The most common new criminal offence in this period was not violence but theft, and specifically theft of food. Grain stores broken into, livestock taken from fields and yards in the night, market stalls raided in daylight, barns emptied, carts ambushed on roads. This was not the opportunistic crime of professional criminals, though professional criminals certainly operated during the famine and took advantage of it. It was the desperate crime of ordinary people, smallholders whose crops had failed, labourers whose employers had nothing to pay them with, urban poor whose normal food-buying capacity had evaporated with the grain price spikes. It was the crime of people who had no other option, as they saw it, and who were choosing between theft and watching their children die. The English royal government's response to the crime surge was simultaneously predictable and illuminating. Edward II issued proclamations against price gouging and hoarding. He attempted to fix grain prices at pre-famine levels, an intervention that, then as now, produced perverse results, driving grain off the official market entirely as sellers refused to sell at mandated prices below what the black market would bear. He also increased penalties for theft, which is to say, faced with widespread food theft by starving people, the royal government's primary response was to make the legal consequences of being caught stealing food more severe. This is not a surprising response from a medieval state, but it is a revealing one. It tells us that the primary mechanism the state had for addressing famine crime was deterrence rather than relief, and that the deterrence was at best partially effective, and at worst added judicial violence to the other forms of violence the famine was already producing. Brigandage, organised robbery, typically of travellers and merchant convoys on the road, expanded significantly during the famine years. This was a different phenomenon from petty food theft. It involved groups of men, many of them former soldiers or men with military experience who had been displaced from normal economic life by the crisis, operating in organised bands and preying on whatever road traffic continued to move. The road network of medieval Northern Europe had been one of the great achievements of the long prosperity, an expanding infrastructure of trade routes, market connections, and communication lines that had enabled the commercial boom of the preceding centuries. During the Great Famine, these roads became dangerous in ways they had not been during more stable periods. The famine also disrupted family structures in ways that are painful to document, but necessary to acknowledge. Medieval family law and custom operated on assumptions of adequate household resources. When a household could not feed all its members, the hierarchies and obligations built into family structure came under pressure they were not designed to sustain. English and continental legal records from the famine years show a significant increase in child abandonment. Parents who could not feed their children left them at monastery gates, at church doors, at the entrances of wealthy households, in the hope that some institution or individual might care for them when their parents could not. Some were taken in, many were not. The abandonment of elderly or disabled family members, those who could not contribute to household food production and placed the greatest demands on household resources, is harder to document from legal records alone, but appears in chronicle accounts and in the archaeological record of skeletal remains from this period that show anomalies consistent with prolonged malnutrition in specific population cohorts. The relationship between lords and peasants, the fundamental social contract of the feudal system, also underwent significant stress during the famine years. The feudal system, at its most simplified, was an exchange. The peasant rendered labour and a portion of their production to the lord in exchange for protection, access to land, and the security of belonging to a defined social unit with collective resources. During good times, this exchange was maintained, not without tension, not without exploitation, but with a basic functional integrity that made it sustainable. During the famine, the exchange broke down from both ends simultaneously. Peasants could not render what they did not have. A lord could demand his portion of the harvest, could insist on his legal rights under the manorial system. But if the harvest was 40% of normal, the legal right to 50% of a normal harvest was a right to something that did not exist. Lords who pressed their legal claims to the full during the famine years added an additional burden of extraction to peasant households already at the breaking point. But lords also found themselves unable to fulfill their side of the bargain. The protection they theoretically offered, against lawlessness, against the violence of neighbouring lords, against the predations of royal taxation, was dependent on a military capacity that was itself dependent on economic resources that the famine was destroying. The war horses being eaten, the revenues falling, the supply of grain needed to sustain soldiers running short. A lord who could not maintain his household could not protect his tenants. The social fabric did not tear completely. Most communities maintained enough coherence to survive the famine years as functioning units. The bonds of neighbourhood, kinship, religious obligation, and simply shared humanity held, imperfectly, under strain, with exceptions and failures, but they held. But the famine left those bonds stretched and changed. Communities that had experienced 7 years of watching neighbours starve, of watching institutions fail, of watching the promises of lords and kings go unfulfilled, those communities emerged from the famine carrying a skepticism about the existing order that would surface again in more explicitly political forms when the next great crisis came. The Great Famine taught a generation that the world could not be trusted to sustain them. That lesson would not be forgotten. The Great Famine found the governments of Northern Europe simultaneously at the height of their medieval administrative sophistication and entirely unprepared for what was happening. The early 14th century represents a genuine peak of medieval governmental capacity. The English royal administration under the Plantagenets had developed, over the preceding century, a remarkably sophisticated apparatus for tax collection, judicial administration, military organisation, and record-keeping. The French Capetian monarchy, similarly, had built an increasingly centralised and literate administrative state. The principalities of the Low Countries and the German-speaking lands had their own variations on this institutional development. These governments were, by any reasonable standard, the most capable administrative entities Europe had produced since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They were not capable of handling a multi-year continental famine. The fundamental limitation was conceptual as much as practical. Medieval governments had a well-developed set of responses to local, short-term food crises, price regulation, temporary export bans on grain, opening of royal granaries, appeals to the church to organise charity. These were all deployed, in various forms, in response to the famine of 1315. What they had no framework for was a sustained, geographically comprehensive, climatically driven failure of the entire agricultural system that underpinned the economy. That was not in the administrative playbook, because it had never happened at this scale within institutional memory. Edward II of England provides perhaps the most historically visible royal case study of famine-era governance, because the English administrative record for this period is unusually rich, and because his response to the famine was entangled with his broader political failures, in ways that illuminate both. Edward was, by most historical assessments, a weak king, not incompetent in any absolute sense, but lacking the qualities of decisive leadership, political skill, and capacity for ruthless prioritization that effective medieval kingship demanded. He had inherited the Plantagenet throne from his father Edward Thorough, one of the most formidable military and administrative kings England had ever produced, and had never stopped paying the political price for not being his father. When the famine hit in 1315, Edward was already in significant political difficulty. His Scottish wars, inherited from Edward Thorough, were going badly. His court was embroiled in the political crisis surrounding his favourite Piers Gaveston, who had been murdered by rebellious barons in 1312. His relationship with the baronage was fractious. Into this political mess, the famine arrived as an additional catastrophe, compounding existing tensions rather than temporarily suspending them. The political relationship between the English crown and its barons during the famine years is an instructive example of how crisis management fails when the managing institution is itself in crisis. The Ordinances of 1311, a series of administrative reforms imposed on Edward by the baronage, had already limited royal freedom of action in significant ways. The Ordainers, the baronial committee that had drafted these reforms, represented a powerful faction that saw the king's administrative incompetence and political recklessness as the source of England's problems. When the famine added economic catastrophe to political dysfunction, the conflict between king and barons over who was responsible and who should manage the response became an additional layer of dysfunction on top of an already failing response. Resources that might have gone to famine relief went instead to the Scottish War, which continued even as England starved. Political energy that might have been directed at systematic food management was consumed by the factional conflict at court. The contrast with France under Philip V, who came to the French throne in 1316 in the depths of the famine, is instructive. Philip, called Le Long, brought a degree of administrative seriousness to the famine response that Edward conspicuously lacked. He organised royal grain purchases, attempted more systematic price regulation, and deployed the machinery of the increasingly sophisticated Capetian administration more effectively than any previous French king had managed during a crisis. But even Philip's more competent response could not address the fundamental problem. The crops were not growing because the climate was wrong, and no governmental intervention, however sophisticated, could change the weather. The Great Famine revealed with painful clarity the outer boundary of what early 14th century government was capable of. It could redistribute, it could regulate, it could organise charity and suppress speculation, and direct military resources and collect taxes. It could do all the things that late medieval government had been building the capacity to do for the preceding century. It could not make it stop raining. It could not restore the harvests. It could not feed 40 million people from central stores that did not exist at anywhere near the necessary scale. And so, the people died, and the governments did what they could, and what they could was not enough. There was one institution that had resources, that had infrastructure, that had personnel spread across the entire landscape of suffering Europe. One institution with granaries and kitchens and networks of care and a motivating ideology that demanded charity as a spiritual obligation. The Church. The Church's role in the Great Famine is a story of genuine heroism and genuine institutional limitation, of extraordinary individuals doing extraordinary things, and of an institution whose resources, however vast by the standards of the time, were dwarfed by the scale of the need. But that is a story for the next chapter. The medieval church was not simply a religious institution. It was the largest, most geographically distributed, most financially sophisticated organizational structure in Western Europe. Its monasteries were simultaneously houses of prayer, centers of agricultural production, granaries, hospitals, schools, scriptoria, and nodes in a continent-wide network of communication and resource exchange. When the Great Famine came, the church was the closest thing Europe had to a coordinated relief infrastructure. Not a designed relief infrastructure, that concept would not exist for centuries, but something that, when the crisis came, could be reoriented toward emergency functions in ways that smaller and less organized entities could not. The Cistercian order is the most striking example of this institutional capacity in action. The Cistercians, the white monks, the reform order of the early 12th century, who had rejected the corruption and comfort of the Benedictines and returned to a strict rule of manual labour and agricultural self-sufficiency, operated by 1315 a network of hundreds of abbeys across northern Europe. Each abbey was designed as a self-sustaining agricultural enterprise, granges and fish ponds and mills and orchards, managed according to the sophisticated agronomy that the Cistercians had developed over 2 centuries of hard intentional practice. When the harvest failed, the Cistercian houses opened their stores. The scale of Cistercian relief operations during the Great Famine is documented in the Order's own records and in chronicle accounts from abbeys across England, France and the Rhineland. Mew Abbey in Yorkshire, for example, records feeding over 1,000 people daily from its stores at the height of the 1316 famine. Fountains Abbey, one of the great Cistercian houses with enormous agricultural holdings, maintained similar operations. In France, Clairvaux, the mother house of the Reform founded by Bernard himself 2 centuries earlier, became a distribution centre for relief across a substantial region. This was not improvised charity. It was an institutional operation, drawing on the Cistercian tradition of systematic agricultural management and on the network connections that the order maintained between its houses. When one abbey was short, it could draw on the resources of others. When roads were too dangerous for individual travellers, the network could move resources collectively. The Benedictine houses similarly served as relief centres, if with less organisational coherence. The great Black Monk abbeys, Westminster, St Albans, Cluny, St Denis, all expanded their charitable operations during the famine years. The Hospitium, the monastery's guest house where travellers and the poor were fed, became an emergency feeding station that operated at scales it had never been designed to handle. But the Church was not only doing practical charity, it was also doing what institutions in crisis always do, trying to explain the crisis in the framework of its own worldview. The theological explanation for the Great Famine was, by the standards of the early 14th century, obvious. God was punishing humanity for its sins. This was not a fringe interpretation. It was the dominant official reading of the catastrophe, produced by the bishops and theologians of the age, and delivered from pulpits across Europe. The famine was a divine chastisement for human moral failure, for pride, for avarice, for lust, for the specific sins that medieval preachers had always identified as the characteristic failings of their age. The appropriate response was penance, prayer, and reform. The theological framework produced 2 contrasting responses among ordinary people. For some, it deepened religious observance. Pilgrimage increased during the famine years, people making their way to shrines and holy sites to seek divine intervention, offering what they had in exchange for whatever mercy might be available. The shrines of popular saints, Thomas Becket at Canterbury, Our Lady of Walsingham, reported dramatic increases in visitors during the worst famine years. These were not comfortable pilgrims on a leisure journey. These were desperate people covering long distances on inadequate food, in the hope that sufficient piety might unlock relief. For others, the experience of watching the Church explain the famine as God's punishment, while simultaneously not fixing the famine, began to do something quieter and more subversive to their relationship with the institution. If the Church's God was the kind of God who would starve 40 million people to make a theological point, what kind of God was that? If the Church's prayers and intercessions and sacraments could not stop the rain or restore the harvest, what exactly was the Church offering? The mendicant orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans, the great preaching friars of the 13th century, occupied a distinctive and in some ways paradoxical position during the Great Famine. The Franciscans, founded on a radical commitment to poverty and a direct engagement with the poor, were in many ways the most ideally positioned of any religious community to respond to famine. Their houses were in the cities, among the poor. Their theological formation oriented them toward exactly the kind of street-level charitable engagement that the famine required. Their founder, Francis of Assisi, had made a point of embracing lepers and eating with the destitute. His followers were at least theoretically committed to the same practices, and many of them were. Franciscan records from the famine years show genuine engagement with relief operations in English and continental cities. Friars who had no granaries to open, poverty being a founding principle of the order, organised collection efforts, served as intermediaries in distributing charitable donations from wealthier individuals and institutions, and maintained the street-level pastoral presence that formal parish structures sometimes failed to provide during a crisis of this magnitude. The Dominicans contributed differently, Through their role as the Church's intellectual and inquisitorial arm, they produced much of the theological literature that attempted to explain the famine in terms of divine judgment and human sin. The Dominican theological framework for the famine was sophisticated in its own terms, drawing on Augustine and Aquinas to place the suffering within a providential narrative that gave it meaning. Whether this meaning-making helped the people who were starving is a question that the sources cannot fully answer. The evidence suggests that it helped some and alienated others, that the same theology of suffering as divine pedagogy that gave some people the framework to endure appeared to others, in the context of children dying, as an intolerable claim. The gap between the institution that explained the famine and the institution that fed people through it, both real expressions of the medieval church, was visible to contemporaries, and the institution that fed people maintained more of its moral authority. The Cistercians' grain, the Benedictines' kitchens, the hospital sisters of the Hôtel Dieu working through waves of sick and malnourished patients. These were what people remembered when the years of suffering finally ended. Not the sermons. These questions did not immediately produce heresy or religious upheaval. The 14th century would see plenty of that. The Lollard movement in England, the Hussites in Bohemia, ultimately the Reformation itself. But those were developments that would come later, driven by many factors. The Great Famine was not their direct cause, but the famine was part of what eroded the implicit confidence in the existing religious and social order that had characterized the long prosperity. It introduced doubt in a place where certainty had lived. It planted a seed of institutional skepticism. If the church cannot help when things get truly terrible, what is it actually for? That would germinate slowly over the following century and a half. God had not made the rain stop. In the long run, that mattered. One of the most psychologically devastating features of the Great Famine, one that distinguishes it from a single catastrophic event that communities might absorb and recover from, was its sheer duration. It did not stop. In 1315, the rains were terrible and the harvest was catastrophic. This was shocking. It was an emergency. It mobilized whatever response the systems of the age could muster. In 1316, the rains came again. The harvest was, in many regions, even worse than 1315, partly because the agricultural system was already depleted, partly because the livestock that had survived 1315 had been further weakened by their second winter without adequate fodder, partly because the seeds that were planted in the flooded soils of spring 1316 were compromised by the wet conditions and produced thin, poor-quality crops, even where they grew at all. Contemporary estimates from England put the 1316 grain harvest at between a third and a half of a normal year. By 1316, the emergency food reserves that had existed in the autumn of 1315 were gone. There was nothing left to draw down. The population was now eating only what could be scraped together, bought at ruinous prices, or produced from the most marginal and desperate of alternatives. In 1317, there was a partial respite. The rains that year were not quite as bad as the two preceding years. The harvest, in England, in France, in parts of Germany, was better, not good. Not remotely close to the pre-famine baseline, but better. This partial respite was, in some ways, almost more cruel than continued disaster would have been. It raised hope. People who had survived 2 years of catastrophe looked at the slightly less terrible harvest of 1317 and wondered if it was over. Officials and lords who had been managing a crisis began to wonder if the crisis was passing. Preparations for what might have been a third year of sustained organised relief began to relax, and then 1318 came. The harvest of 1318 was poor again, not 1315 or 1316 catastrophic, but significantly below what a recovered population needed to start rebuilding reserves and restoring the agricultural base. The brief hope of 1317 made 1318's shortfall feel, psychologically, like a second catastrophe almost as punishing as the first. The years 1319 through 1321 brought additional catastrophe in the form of the murrain, the cattle plague we have already discussed, piled on top of still inadequate harvests. The agricultural system was being hit again and again before it had any chance to recover, like a person struck repeatedly while trying to stand up. By 1320, a generation had grown up knowing nothing but hardship. Children who had been born in 1310, 5 years old when the famine started, were now 10, and for their entire conscious lives, the world had been a place of cold, hunger, disease, and loss. Their parents, those who survived, were aged beyond their years, their bodies depleted by years of inadequate nutrition, their psychological resilience worn to a minimum. The exhaustion of hope is one of the most significant and least quantifiable dimensions of the Great Famine's impact. Medieval theology encouraged a specific relationship to suffering. God sends trials to test and strengthen faith. The good Christian endures, prays, and trusts that relief is coming, that God's mercy will operate within the apparent disaster, that there is meaning and purpose in the pain. This theological framework for endurance was genuinely functional for shorter crises. A bad year, a hard winter, even a short-term famine, these could be absorbed within a framework that promised eventual relief. But 7 years is a long time to wait for God's mercy. The chronicle evidence from the later famine years, 1319, 1320, 1321, shows a striking shift in the emotional register of the accounts. The earlier chronicles recorded the famine with something like shock, the language of extraordinary events, of unprecedented disaster, of God's terrible judgment. The later chronicles are flatter, more matter-of-fact. Chroniclers who in 1315 and 1316 wrote with visible emotion about the deaths of the poor were by 1320 recording mortality figures with something closer to bureaucratic resignation. This is not evidence of callousness. It is evidence of what sustained crisis does to the people who live through it and document it. After years of horror, horror becomes the baseline. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The language available to describe disaster stops being adequate to what is actually happening, and chroniclers fall back on accounting language, numbers of dead, quantities of grain, prices per bushel, because the emotional vocabulary has been exhausted. What this means for historians is that the later years of the Great Famine may be underdocumented in terms of their human texture, precisely because the people who were experiencing and recording them were too worn down to maintain the level of descriptive attention they had brought to the opening catastrophe. What it means for the people who lived through it is both simpler and harder. They were tired, they were diminished, they had seen things that should not have happened, they had done things they should not have had to do, and they were still there, still alive, still putting one foot in front of the other through mud and rain and loss, because that is what human beings do when they have no other choice. The harvest began, gradually and incompletely, to recover. The Great Famine was over. It left behind something that even its ending could not entirely undo. The Great Famine killed between 10 and 25% of the population of Northern Europe. The range of that estimate reflects the difficulty of accurate historical demography for this period, and the significant variation in mortality between regions, between urban and rural environments, between wealthy and poor communities, and between the years of the famine itself. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this. In the 3 centuries of the long prosperity, from roughly 950 to roughly 1300, the population of Europe had grown from perhaps 35 million to perhaps 75 million. In the 7 years of the Great Famine, between 2 million and perhaps 10 million of those people died. The upper estimates, for some of the hardest hit regions, suggest that certain areas lost close to a quarter of their population. This was not the catastrophic 30 to 60% mortality of the Black Death that would arrive in 1347. But it was a demographic wound of extraordinary depth and width, and because it fell primarily on the most vulnerable, children, the elderly, the poor, those already weakened by marginal nutrition before the famine began, its effects on the age structure and productive capacity of the surviving population were disproportionate to the raw numbers. The demographic wound did not heal quickly. In medieval conditions, population recovery from major mortality events was slow. Women who had survived the famine years in a state of severe malnutrition had reduced fertility. Chronic caloric deficit disrupts reproductive hormonal function, often stopping menstruation entirely. Children who survived the famine's worst years carried in their bodies the evidence of what they had endured. Growth faltering visible in skeletal remains, immune systems compromised by years of inadequate micronutrient intake, bodies permanently smaller and more vulnerable than they would have been in better conditions. A generation that grew up hungry did not simply bounce back to normal health when the food returned. The body keeps the score. The physiological effects of childhood malnutrition are lasting and cumulative. The generation that would face the Black Death in 1347 had been shaped, in their bodies and in their immune systems, by the Great Famine of their childhood. The agricultural system was the other great casualty of the famine, and its recovery was equally slow. The livestock losses we have discussed, the cattle murrain that followed the famine, the deliberate slaughter of breeding stock during the worst years, the starvation of draft animals, left the European agricultural system operating without adequate animal power for a decade after the famine's formal end. Fields that needed deep ploughing got shallow ploughing or none at all. Crops that needed adequate fertilization, the manure from healthy cattle populations, grew on impoverished soil. The grain yields of the 1320s and 1330s in many regions never fully returned to pre-famine levels. The forest clearances of the long prosperity, the enormous expansion of agricultural land that had been one of the era's most visible achievements, were partially reversed. Marginal land that had been brought under cultivation during the warm centuries, land that required intensive management to be productive, began to revert. Farms on thin hillside soils were abandoned when their owners died or moved to better land. Drainage systems on reclaimed wetlands fell into disrepair when there were not enough people or animals to maintain them. The living edge of cultivation retreated. The economic consequences of the famine extended beyond the agricultural sector. The great commercial cities of northern Europe, Bruges, Ypres, Ghent, London, Paris, Cologne, had been built on the foundation of the long prosperity's commercial expansion. Their populations, their trade volumes, their manufacturing capacity, all were dependent on the agricultural surplus that funded consumption, that fed the workers, that underwrote the whole system. The famine broke that foundation. Urban populations collapsed. The great cloth towns of Flanders, Ypres above all, but Bruges and Ghent too, never fully recovered the commercial dominance they had held in the years before 1315. Their populations were smaller, their economic output was lower, their role in the European commercial network was diminished. The commercial reorientation of northern European trade that would eventually shift the centre of gravity from Flanders toward the Hanseatic cities of the Baltic coast and the rising commercial power of Holland was a process with many causes. But the Great Famine was among them. The art and literature of the period following the Great Famine carries the famine's mark in ways that art historians have only recently begun to fully appreciate. The great building campaigns of the High Gothic period, the phase of cathedral construction that had filled the 12th and 13th centuries with the most ambitious architectural projects humanity had ever undertaken, slowed significantly after 1315 and in many cases stopped entirely. Cathedrals that were mid-construction in 1315 were not completed on schedule. New projects that had been in planning stages were deferred. The financial and human resources that had sustained the building campaigns were redirected by crisis, and many of them never came back. What replaced the triumphalist, upward-reaching aesthetic of the High Gothic in the literature and visual art of the mid and late 14th century was something darker, more intimate, more preoccupied with mortality and bodily reality. The allegory of the Très Riche Heure, the emergence of the danse macabre as a visual motif, the particular obsession with the physical reality of death that characterizes so much late medieval art. These are features of a culture that had been living with mass death for decades. The literature of the period tells a similar story. The 14th century produced Dante's great journey through the afterlife, begun before the famine but completed in its shadow. It produced Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the Black Death but shaped by a generation that had already processed the Great Famine. It produced Chaucer, whose Canterbury tales move through a world that is simultaneously vibrantly alive and profoundly aware of death's proximity, and in the German-speaking world, the mystical literature of Meister Eckhart and the Devotio Moderna movement, an inward-turning spirituality that found God not in the grand institutional structures of church and court, but in the quiet of the individual soul, reflected a changed relationship with the very institutions that had failed the famine generation. These literary and artistic forms were not simple responses to the famine alone. They were responses to a generation of catastrophe, famine and plague together, the compound disaster that had remade the European world between 1315 and 1350. But the famine was the first and in some ways the most formative of those catastrophes. It was the disaster that taught the generation of the Black Death what mass death felt like, what institutional failure looked like, what it meant for the ordinary structures of life to come apart. The art that processed the plague was built on an emotional vocabulary that the famine had already developed. the late medieval preoccupation with transience, the ubi sunt tradition, the poems asking where are those who lived here before us, the visual motifs of skulls and hourglasses, the insistence on the fragility of beauty and power. This is not the cultural expression of a civilization that was simply gloomy by temperament. It is the cultural expression of a civilization that had learned through the specific experience of the 14th century that beauty and power and prosperity were genuinely fragile, that the warmth could stop, that the harvest could fail, that the city could be emptied, that the cathedral could stand empty. They knew this not from philosophy but from memory. The psychological and cultural consequences of the Great Famine are harder to quantify, but no less significant. A civilization that had spent 3 centuries growing in population, in economic sophistication, in cultural ambition, in physical infrastructure, suddenly contracted. The assumption of progress, the implicit belief that things would continue to expand and improve that had underlain the great building campaigns, the commercial expansion, the intellectual flowering of the 12th and 13th centuries, that assumption was challenged in ways that no theoretical argument could challenge it. The world had gotten worse, objectively, materially, measurably, demonstrably worse. And it had gotten worse not because of human error or divine punishment in any specific sense, but because the climate had changed. Because something entirely outside human agency and human moral structure had altered the conditions of existence. This was a profoundly disorienting thing to know. Medieval cosmology was built on the assumption of a divinely ordered, stable natural world, a creation that, while fallen, operated according to the providential plan of its maker. The climate was not supposed to change without reason. The harvests were not supposed to fail for 7 consecutive years without reference to human sin and divine response. The Great Famine did not immediately produce a new intellectual framework for understanding climate or nature, or the relationship between the human and natural worlds. That would take centuries. But it did introduce, quietly, subversively, through the lived experience of 40 million people, a doubt about the reliability of the natural order that had not been present with the same force before. The world could be less, the world could be colder, the world that God had made could turn against the people living in it, for reasons that had nothing to do with their sins and could not be addressed by their prayers. That knowledge, once learned, could not be unlearned. In 1347, a generation after the last fanes finally lifted, the Black Death arrived in Europe. It came from the east, from Central Asia, carried along the trade routes that connected the Mongol-dominated steppe to the Black Sea, and from there to the Mediterranean. It arrived in Sicily in October 1347, moved to Genoa and Marseille in early 1348, and then spread across the continent with a speed that people who had survived the slow-grinding years of the famine found incomprehensible. The famine had been terrible, but it had been slow. The plague moved in weeks, in days. In 3 to 4 years, the Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of the European population. In absolute numbers, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. It was, by any measure, the worst demographic catastrophe in recorded European history. And the Great Famine, it is now clear, helped make it possible. The connection between the Great Famine and the Black Death is not a simple matter of one causing the other. The plague would have arrived in Europe regardless of whether the famine had happened. Yersinia pestis did not care about the state of European granaries or the condition of European immune systems. It was a bacterium following its own ecological logic. But what the famine had done to European bodies and European society made the plague's impact worse, in specific and measurable ways. The generation that faced the Black Death in 1347 was, in a very literal physiological sense, the generation that had grown up during the Great Famine. People who were between 35 and 50 in 1347, the core of the adult working population, the generation doing most of the farming and manufacturing and soldiering and governing, had been children and young adults during the worst famine years. Their bodies carried that history. Research in historical osteology, the study of human skeletal remains, has produced compelling evidence that populations experiencing prolonged nutritional stress show characteristic bone changes that indicate compromised immune function, increased susceptibility to infection, and reduced resilience to the kind of whole-body physiological assault that plague represents. The skeletal populations from the early 14th century, the famine generations, show exactly these markers. The livestock collapse of the famine years also contributed to the ecological conditions that the plague exploited. Medieval agriculture depended on a dynamic involving humans, grain, rats, and the cats and dogs that preyed on rats. A healthy agricultural ecosystem with adequate grain supplies, functioning granaries, and reasonable populations of domestic predators kept rodent populations at manageable levels. When the famine disrupted this balance, when grain stores were exhausted, when cats and dogs were eaten, when the normal management of grain storage facilities broke down, rat populations expanded into the vacuum. Rats are the primary reservoir of Yersinia pestis in Europe. More rats, living in closer contact with human populations, meant greater opportunity for the disease, when it arrived, to establish itself quickly and spread effectively. The plague of 1347 found a Europe that was biologically and ecologically more vulnerable to it than it would have been without the preceding decades of famine-induced disruption. There is also the question of social and institutional vulnerability. The Great Famine had damaged the social fabric of European communities in ways that left them poorly positioned to manage the kind of collective response that effective epidemic control requires. Communities that had spent 7 years under extreme stress, that had experienced the breakdown of normal patterns of trust and mutual support, that had seen the failure of both royal government and ecclesiastical institution to protect them from disaster. These were not communities at peak capacity for organised, disciplined response to a new catastrophe. The Black Death arrived in communities that were, in significant ways, already broken. Not completely, not beyond function, but weakened, diminished, carrying the memories and the consequences of a decade of suffering. And the plague swept through them like fire through dry grass. The relationship between the Great Famine and the Black Death is not finally a story of simple causation. The plague was its own catastrophe, driven by its own biology and its own historical contingencies. But it is a story of compounding, of one great disaster leaving a world that was more vulnerable to the next great disaster, of a civilization whose reserves of food, of animals, of population, of social cohesion, of institutional trust, of biological resilience, had been systematically depleted, and which then faced a challenge that would have tested a civilization at full strength to the utmost. The Great Famine did not cause the Black Death, but the Great Famine is part of why the Black Death killed so many. The famine and the plague together constitute the pivot point of the medieval world. Before 1315, expansion, optimism, the confident verticality of Gothic cathedrals stretching toward a reliable heaven. After 1350, contraction, doubt, the dense and earthy preoccupation with death and transience that characterizes late medieval culture. The long prosperity was over. The long catastrophe had passed. What came after was different from everything before it, and understanding the Great Famine is essential to understanding why. The farmer in Burgundy who knelt in the ruined field in 1315 is not remembered by name. His chronicle is not the chronicle of a great king or a famous bishop or a renowned merchant or a celebrated scholar. He left no written record. He appears in the history of the Great Famine only as an archetypal figure, the representative of millions of people for whom no specific account exists, who lived and suffered and tried and often died in anonymity. But he was real. He was one of the 40 million people who stood in the same rain, stared at the same ruined harvest, made the same brutal calculations about how to feed their children through another cold and terrible winter. He was one of the millions who ate bark and boiled leather and dug through frozen fields for things that might be food and prayed with increasing desperation to a God who seemed not to be listening. He was also, if he survived, if he was among those who came through the other side, one of the people who rebuilt. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 is not the most famous catastrophe of the medieval period. It does not have the symbolic weight of the Black Death, which arrived 2 decades later and killed more absolutely and more swiftly, and generated a body of art and culture and psychological response that has remained visible to us ever since. The Great Famine is quieter, its deaths were slower, its documentary record is less dramatic, its cultural processing was more internal, more absorbed into the fabric of ongoing life rather than expressed in the explosive symbolic responses, the flagellants, the dance of death, the apocalyptic imagery that the plague provoked. But in some ways, this quietness makes it more important to understand, not less. The Great Famine was the first great rupture in the long prosperity. It was the moment when the medieval world first discovered that what it had taken for granted, the reliable warmth, the expanding harvests, the assumption that things would continue to grow, was not guaranteed. It was the experience that shaped the generation who would face the plague, that dimmed the institutions that would try and fail to manage the plague, that left the landscape and the bodies and the communities of Northern Europe in the depleted state they were in when the plague arrived. The climate itself was the invisible antagonist, the most powerful force in this story, and the one that none of the actors in it could perceive, name, or address. No king could negotiate with the Atlantic storm systems. No bishop could pray the cold away. No merchant could find a trade route around the failing harvests. The people of medieval Europe were not stupid or unobservant. They were acutely aware of their weather, dependent on it in ways we have difficulty fully imagining. But they had no framework for understanding climate as a variable system, no concept of long-term climatic cycles, no way of perceiving the shift from the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age as anything other than a run of terrible luck or divine displeasure. They were living inside a climate story that was too large and too long to see from inside. We are living inside our own climate story, one that is also too large and too long to fully see from inside it. We have advantages they did not: scientific instrumentation, satellite observation, centuries of climate data, a theoretical framework for understanding how and why climates change. We can see more of the pattern than they could. Whether we respond to that knowledge better than they could respond to their ignorance, that is a question this history cannot answer. It can only offer the record of what happens when civilizations built on the assumption of stable climate encounter a world that is changing. The rain stopped. The summer came back. The fields grew again. And the people who had survived the Great Frost, carrying their damaged bodies and their exhausted faith and their knowledge of how bad things could get, went back into the fields and planted their seed and prayed for good weather. Because that is what you do when you have no other choice. Because that is what we have always done. Because the field does not care about the history of the field. The field only knows what you plant in it today. And what you plant today is the only answer available to whatever darkness came before. And the sound of rain beginning again, but this time, just enough. The good rain, the needed rain, the rain the seed was waiting for.